All right, let's dive into Gone with the Wind today. It's a book, well, it's more than a book, really. It's a whole world, isn't it? We're going to try to understand what makes this story tick, why people are still talking about it almost 100 years later. We've got some interesting stuff from Wikipedia, some analyses, all sorts of things. We're going to unearth some pretty surprising stuff, I think.
It's interesting when you think about it. Gone with the Wind really captures this very specific moment in American history. The Civil War, Reconstruction. It's like looking through a window at this huge, huge period of change, social and political upheaval, all through these really big personalities.
Oh, absolutely. And speaking of big personalities, we can't talk about Gone with the Wind without talking about Scarlett O'Hara. She is the heart of the story, isn't she? What is it about her that makes her so, I don't know, so fascinating even now?
I think Scarlett is so compelling because she really goes against what you'd expect from a Southern belle. I mean, she's flawed, she's ambitious, and she's unbelievably resilient, especially in a society that was constantly trying to put women in a box. She's driven by this need to survive, to protect her family and Tara, their plantation.
Hmm.
She's not afraid to use her charm or her wit or even bend the rules a little bit to get what she needs.
It's funny, the book even mentions that she's not conventionally beautiful, which you wouldn't expect, right? Like you think of Southern belles and you think of, classic beauty.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Mitchell saying, look, her power doesn't come from just looks. There's something more there. Like her business sense, for example, especially with that whole sawmill thing, that was really unusual for a woman back then, especially after the war. The South was trying to go back to the old ways, and here's Scarlett running a business.
Now, Scarlett's obviously the star, but we can't forget the men in her life, right? Ashley, Rhett, they really add another dimension to the story. How did they reflect the different ways men dealt with, well, everything that happened during and after the Civil War?
They're like two sides of the same coin. Ashley, he's holding on to the past, this idea of the old South, chivalry, all that. A world that's basically gone. He's sensitive, poetic even, but he just doesn't have that forcefulness.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if he's really the hero Scarlett thinks he is or if he's just stuck.
Yeah, it's like he's paralyzed by the loss of the old ways, stuck in this dream of what used to be.
Right, exactly. Now, Rhett, he's the opposite. He's a pragmatist, a scoundrel, a scalawag even, Mitchell calls him. He sees opportunity in all the chaos of Reconstruction, and he's not afraid to profit from it, even if it means going against what society expects.
He definitely doesn't play by the rules. That pragmatism, that willingness to kind of exploit the system, it forces you to think about, well, what does it really mean to survive in a world like that? Is he a villain or just a product of his environment?
That's what's so interesting about Rhett, right? He doesn't fit neatly into those boxes of hero or villain. He's this new kind of Southern man, adapting, even exploiting things to get ahead. It's a stark contrast to Ashley, and in a way, it might even be a more realistic portrayal of how the South had to change to survive.
So we've talked about Scarlett, the men in her life, but we can't ignore the elephant in the room, right? The portrayal of slavery and race in Gone with the Wind. It's something that's been talked about a lot, and for good reason.
Absolutely. It's really important to acknowledge that Gone with the Wind shows us a romanticized view of the antebellum South. It was a common view in the 1930s when the book was written, and it's been criticized, and rightly so, for perpetuating harmful stereotypes, for downplaying how brutal slavery actually was.
The book even separates enslaved people into these different, almost like castes, implying that some were, happy with their situation, which is hard to believe.
It depends on who you're talking about, right? Mitchell portrays them differently depending on their roles. The house servants, especially Mammy, they're shown as loyal, content, almost like part of the family, which of course reinforces this really dangerous narrative that slavery wasn't that bad, that it ignored the fact that these people were denied basic human rights.
And the field workers, they're depicted completely differently, aren't they?
Yes, they're often portrayed as, well, less intelligent, and Mitchell even suggests they were prone to running wild after emancipation, which again plays into those racist stereotypes of the time, distorting the reality of what black people faced during Reconstruction.
And then there's the Ku Klux Klan. The way they're shown in the book has caused a lot of controversy, hasn't it?
Yeah, their actions are presented as, well, almost a necessary response to black people gaining power after the war. This completely romanticized view ignores the Klan's history of violence and terrorism. It makes you ask, how do we deal with art that has these outdated, harmful views? Do we ignore it, or can we use it to understand how things were and how far we've come?
It's a tough question, and it's one we need to think about carefully.
Yeah, I think it's a question we all need to wrestle with when we're dealing with art that tackles these sensitive parts of history. We
Mhm.
can't ignore the context, but we also can't let those biases just slide.
I guess that's the thing with Gone with the Wind, right? It's a reflection of its time, but it still manages to make people talk, to make people think, almost 100 years later.
Yeah.
What do you think it is about this story that keeps people coming back?
It's a mix of things, I think. For one, it deals with these really universal themes: survival, love, loss, society's changing. I mean, those are things everyone can relate to, no matter who you are or where you're from. We all get what it means to struggle, to fight for what you believe in, to deal with the messiness of relationships.
And you see all of that in Scarlet, right?
Yeah.
She loses everything, family, home, her whole way of life, but she never gives up, picks herself up and starts over again and again.
Exactly. That resilience of hers, that determination, it's powerful. She's not always the most likable character, sure, and she definitely makes some bad decisions. But you can't help but admire her strength. She's a reminder that we all have the capacity to get through tough times, even when everything feels like it's falling apart.
And then there's the love story, or I guess the love triangle, right? You can't deny that Mitchell knows how to write a page-turner. All
Yeah.
that yearning, the push and pull, Scarlett's obsession with Ashley, the whole roller coaster with Rhett, it pulls you in.
It's true, and it's all set against this backdrop of a society that's completely transforming. The romance, it isn't just about personal feelings, it reflects how everything's shifting in the South after the war. These characters are trying to figure out their own hearts while the world around them is rewriting all the rules.
We also have to talk about the setting, right? The antebellum South. The plantations, the balls, well, this idea of a more elegant way of life, even if we know it wasn't all sunshine and roses, it still has this, I don't know, this romantic appeal.
Oh, there's definitely a nostalgia factor there. Gone with the Wind creates this world that's almost mythical.
Mm.
It lets readers escape into this bygone era, and it captures the beauty of the antebellum South Shore, but it also shows how fragile that world was, how it all came crashing down.
And this world, it's resonated with people for generations, hasn't it?
Hmm.
It's inspired movies, fan communities. I mean, there's even a term for the diehard fans, the Windies.
The Windies, yeah, they're proof of how powerful this book is. Dressing up in those period costumes, going to conventions, keeping the story alive. And it's not just one generation, it's all over the world, all connected by their love for this book. It shows how stories can bring people together, create a sense of belonging.
It's clear that Gone with the Wind is more than just a book. It's become this cultural phenomenon. And it's still sparking conversations, debates. People are
Wow.
still finding new ways to interpret it.
Exactly. It's made people talk about race, gender, history, storytelling itself, and those conversations are just as relevant today as they were back then. That's the sign of a truly great work of art, I think, its ability to speak to people across time.
So as we dig deeper into this legacy,
Mm.
I think it's important to look at both the good and the bad. For you, what are the biggest things that stand out from our conversation so far?
Well, I think it's safe to say Gone with the Wind is complicated, right?
Of
It's got
course.
all these layers. On the one hand, you have this incredible story, these characters you can't help but get invested in, themes that are timeless, really. It takes you right back to that time, lets you experience the grandeur, the chaos of the Civil War, Reconstruction, the whole thing.
But on the other hand, it paints this picture of the past that, well, it just isn't accurate. It glosses over the really awful things about slavery and reinforces some pretty harmful stereotypes, doesn't it?
Mhm.
It reminds us that even the things we love, the art we enjoy, can be flawed, can reflect the biases of the time they were created in.
It's a tricky thing, isn't it? Trying to appreciate the art itself while also, acknowledging the problems. I think that's something we run into all the time with anything historical, any piece of art from the past. We have to be critical. We have to remember that how we see the past, well, it changes, it evolves.
It's like, imagine you find this beautiful antique clock, right? The craftsmanship is amazing, but the way it tells time, well, it might not be exactly right by today's standards.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You can admire the beauty, the artistry, but you also have to recognize the limitations. In fact, maybe by looking at those limitations, by understanding when and how something was made, we can understand it better, see how it fits into the bigger picture.
So when it comes to Gone with the Wind, how do you think people today should approach it? With all these complexities, these contradictions, do we just toss it aside because it's, a product of a different time? Or is there still something valuable there?
Honestly, I don't think there's one right answer. Everyone has to figure that out for themselves. But I think it's important to remember that Gone with the Wind, It's not just a romance. It's not just a historical drama. It reflects this very specific moment in American history, this time when the country was trying to figure out huge, huge questions: race, identity, what freedom really meant.
It's like a reminder that history isn't simple, right? There's so much nuance, so many contradictions. And it's on us to grapple with that, to try to understand the past, even with all its messiness.
Exactly. And Gone with the Wind, with all its flaws, it gives us a chance to do that. It makes us face some uncomfortable truths about our history, and maybe it even helps us look at our own biases.
So you're saying that even art that's difficult, that we might disagree with, it can still be valuable. It can make us think critically, make us look inward.
Oh, absolutely. It's not always easy. It might even be uncomfortable at times, but it can be really rewarding. It helps us see things from different angles, challenge what we think we know, understand the world better.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Gone with the Wind, I want to leave you with this. How can we use stories like this, stories that are both engaging and problematic, to start conversations about race, history, the power of stories themselves? Those conversations are so important now more than ever. Thanks for joining us today, and remember, tomorrow is another day.